Hi. Hi, everybody. My name's Vaseem Khan. As said, I'm a data leader from a company called FullStory. Really excited to be here. I think, firstly, just how good is it to be in front of people, you know, pandemic gone. It's just good to not live in pajamas, be on Zoom. So big awooga to that. Really excited to talk about empowering researchers in product teams today. But I think before we get started, it'll be great for our panel to give a quick introductions in terms of their role, their focus areas, and then we'll build from there. If I can start with you.
Thanks, Vaseem. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. This is my first in-person conference after the pandemic. So awesome to see so many faces. Yeah, I've been in 15 years in gaming, guys. Basically worked across platforms starting from PC, console, casino, Nintendo, Wii, and last 8 years in the mobile space. And currently I'm heading market intelligence, UX and user research at Wildlife, which is one of the top 50 publishers of mobile games in the world. And yeah, my journey, I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of IPs. So some of the games I've worked for include franchises like Star Trek, Ice Age, My Little Pony, Disney, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alexandra. I'm a CPO at Uptime, which is an IoT French startup. And just before that, I was CPO at a Signature Group. Basically, there were 3 companies that merged together to be a European leader. And before that, I was leading all the product and design teams at Airco, which is one of the latest French unicorns as well. And before that, I had another 10 years in product and design in different companies.
Amazing. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Duaa. I'm currently a senior researcher at Square. Previously coming from academia, I think we've spoken a little bit about that academia or UX research pipeline. Currently working within Square Banking, which is a program where we provide banking services for small businesses who are specifically those small businesses who currently process their payments through Square.
Amazing. Thank you. So today's topic is how do we empower researchers in product teams? It's a topic that's close to my heart. I've worked with both researchers and product teams for many years, and I've lived and breathed both the cultural as well as the data transformation that research teams and product teams have taken. And what's interesting for me is to see the transformation in terms of the team structure, so how teams have adapted as companies have grown and how business priorities have shifted. So I think a good place to start, because we've got such a diverse panel from different companies, it'll be good to understand, well, how are their teams structured, you know, and how are their teams shifted as teams have grown. So maybe if I start with it'll be good to get an understanding of your team, how your team's developed, how your team is structured, and then we can build from there.
Sure, thanks, Vaseem. So for me, guys, it's a bit interesting because I have almost 3 different teams. So one of them is a centralized team, which is made up of user researchers. So it's more like a service team. It's a centralized team, and it serves different products. So we have new games, which are like product under development. And then there are these live game operations, which are product which are mature and out in the market. So this centralized team serves the need of both the divisions, business divisions. But then I have a UX team which was also earlier a centralized team, but then we had a reorg, and now they're embedded into each product. So it's interesting because for me, what's important is I want to make sure that they're communicating with each other, but there are challenges to both. Like in a centralized team, there's a lot of context switching, but in a decentralized team, there's this risk of siloing teams. So at the moment, yeah, I'm handling both of them and trying to make the most of it.
Just so I understand the terminology correctly, so when you mean centralized, it's a shared resource across the entire business.
Across the entire org, yeah.
That's really interesting, and I'll certainly come back to that because it'll be, I think, interesting to understand how do you align the business priorities when you've got different teams and different products and challenges. Alexandra, I know you've got quite a varied background. You've worked for Scale Up, and you've also worked for a unicorn out in France. It'll be interesting to understand your take and the types of teams that you work with.
Yeah, of course. So in my case, I worked mostly with decentralized teams. So basically, having a role like a product designer that is able to do everything from the research to testing and to implementation, and they will be embedded in a team that has a certain mission, and they work daily with their like PMs and engineers. And what I've seen working pretty nicely in this is that the teams are very autonomous in their learning, and they can go pretty fast, and they can get closer and easier to continuous discovery as they have this resource that is able to do that. It's not always easy to have people that have these skills, especially when the companies grow, especially at a certain level when they can be really good at the research part, but also at the rest. So that's when like there are some challenges that come in, and also as I was saying with silos and communication, that we need to make sure it is more fluid and everyone has the information needed. But in my case, like in the previous 3 companies, it was mostly product designers that we were growing in time and in the teams.
That's really interesting, and we'll certainly touch on that concept of decentralized, and as teams grow, how do you keep aligning priorities and making sure, because to some extent, in some context, it then feeds back into that centralized overarching theme, right? So we'll certainly come back into that. Duaa, I know you're working with Square Banking, really interesting growth that we've seen with Square Banking, so I'd love to understand from your world how your teams are structured and what you're seeing in your world.
Yeah, so we're a decentralized team, but one way to, I know that we sort of have this description of centralized versus decentralized, but to some degree I feel like there's still some hybridness associated with that. So we are a decentralized team. Each of our designers and researchers are embedded within specific product teams, but obviously the ratio isn't always perfect, so you're supporting more than one product team. So to that sense, you're almost, in that sort of service model centralized team. And then we also have sort of our centralized working group where we are all sort of associating with each other, having meetings together so that we're not losing that connection. And I think that that's part of the challenge with decentralized teams, where you're losing that connection with other product designers and other researchers. And then with our team, it's not just designers, it's creative as well. So you have content designers and our creative team as well within our design org.
Interesting. So there's 2 parts to that, right? You kind of mentioned that the teams are decentralized, and to an extent they're kind of working in their own silos. But obviously you are working for Square, and Square have got their own business priorities that they're trying to push out to market. So how do you make sure teams are aligned to those business priorities whilst making sure the teams themselves are empowered and doing what they need to do to be successful?
I think for the most part, because we are embedded within each of those product teams, most of the product designers and researchers is sitting in those meetings and have that context. And so that's obviously the benefit of being in a decentralized team, where you're not necessarily having to do that context switching, which is kind of the challenge with like a centralized model, where you're doing that context switching quite a bit and not necessarily having the knowledge and the context that you need to support those projects.
What do you lose with that model then?
What do you mean?
So in terms of that decentralization of the team from the overarching structure, I'm assuming it's quite easy to be siloed and live in that silo opposed to understanding the overarching objective.
Yeah, so because of that, we do have our sort of our team meetings where we are, in constant sort of communication with each other, making sure we're not repeating research, especially with researchers. As a researcher, there's that challenge of, having sort of similar research priorities because it is under one company. And so you're making sure you're not doing repeat research and things like that. So making sure within those decentralized models to continue sort of those bridges between other researchers and other designers. Interesting.
And Alex, I'd love to hear your take, because Aircall, I think everybody knows their story, French unicorn, and I think you joined and helped scale Aircall from a very small team to a very diverse and very large team. So I'd love to understand your insight in terms of how you kept sort of the overarching business goals present and what limitations you saw as the team scaled.
Yeah, I think in terms of goals, indeed, it's really important, like more like the big picture as well, like just having that like North Star metric that aligns everyone, having OKRs and everyone knowing into what they're feeding and what their impact is supposed to be. Then in terms of what you were saying on like how you synchronize everyone, because as the company gets a bit bigger, like the sync and the silos become pretty critical. Like we also had like team meetings as you were saying, but also just sharing that information widely with other departments, with the company as well. Also small things like just like if I'm in research and I learn something about someone else's product, just tagging that person or tagging that information as well. So everyone being okay, empowered on their impact, but also not being like, oh, this is not something I care about and just throw it, but really like relaying that information to the persons that will really take care of that as well.
Absolutely. So what you're saying is you need constant validation and constant contact with the teams, so you are sharing ideas and making sure you're not kind of working in silos.
Exactly, yeah. And something else that we were doing, I think it was somehow easier, I've seen that happening pretty well in small startup, is that, for example, if you only have 2 designers, sometimes you can have them switch teams as well. And in that case, like both of them in time, and then when someone else joins as well, like have all the context. When the company is still pretty small, that works pretty nicely. And then if someone leaves, like the other person still has a view on everything. Like it depends how at ease are the teams with change, and if like sometimes even when having product designers, like they're not all super experienced, so can you actually give them the responsibility of a different team or not? But in some cases it works really nicely.
Interesting, and we'll certainly come to that concept of scaling and as teams grow, and how do you embrace that change. But Armand, love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think a lot of good information, the ladies mentioned. In my case, it all starts with what's the maturity of the org I'm joining. So I classify no maturity, low maturity. When talking about UX, UI and high maturity. Yep. In my experience, 70% of the companies are either no UX, UI maturity or low. What I might mean by no is there's no existence of UX, UI in that company, or there is some form of UX, UI they do, but it's not perfect. So first thing is to gauge that. And like in my case, how I try to structure is, just taking an example of wildlife. It was a low UX maturity company. They had UX designers, but they were not following the processes, all the processes. So for me, how the hierarchy looks is it's team over people, discipline over team, and then institution over discipline. So that's the way I stack it. And at the institutional level, something like what Alex said, even if I'm not there tomorrow or none of the members are there, what is it that will guide the people? So we created a UXR, human-centered design institution, and it's a combination, a discipline responsible for craft, aligning the goals of the company. So we looked at the OKR, company OKRs, we developed developmental OKRs, we looked at company vision, then we say how can we tailor our vision which incorporates that. Yep. And also the values. For example, one of the values Wildlife has, we are fast, because they came from a startup phase almost 4 years back. So we are like, how do we incorporate that into UX, UI discipline? We are like, yeah, if our product managers need to make decisions fast, then we need to, especially for new products, we need to find these processes and pipelines without cutting corner where we can help them move fast with research and design. So I think keeping those OKRs which feed into company vision is very important. Yep. These teams to.
Interesting. That's really interesting, and I think part of what you said there is the change management piece, right? In terms of going from a smaller company to a larger company. How do you manage that change? What's the best way to, because you're going to have, and part of this phrase, but you're going to have technical debt in terms of people who are working the way they've been working, and it's been working, so we're going to work the same way. But obviously, as the company's grown, things have changed. So that same way of working perhaps isn't the best way to carry out research. So how do you manage that process? Because obviously you're not going to manage these people out of the business, but how do you bring them on board in terms of the new journey, and what does that process look like?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So change management is built into the job, because it doesn't matter small, in my experience at least, small company, big companies, there's always reorgs. It might come at 6 months, 1 year, and they're like these huge earthquakes. They can move departments around, teams around, your own job role can change. I'm sure all of us have experienced it. So I think first thing is for alignment, to build traction, like as you said, So they're used to working a certain way, and then you're like, hey, by the way, this is our entire UXR pipeline. We should have a discovery phase, we should have an ideation phase, and we should, do voice of customer or focus groups and all that good stuff. But it always comes down to proving value. So for me, I also try to create a safe place to fail. So what we do is, for me, it's more important to get momentum rather than getting it right, especially if we are pioneering new techniques. So I tell my team, so we do a lot of design thinking, and we are like taking these de-risk projects. For example, if I go to a team and say, hey, you're releasing this feature next month, do you want us to take it to the UXR pipeline? They're like, no, there's too much risk. I don't have the time, it's already planned for. I look at a feature which is 3 months, 6 months down the line, and I say, hey, you guys have time. Can we run this through our entire process and show you the value? So these are some of the ways, if we are able to do that, demonstrate value, we automatically get traction, and build momentum.
Interesting. So it's constantly validating, constantly showing how you can show value to bring people on board and push that journey.
Yeah, only thing to add there is, Vaseem, I think it's important to see this tactical day-to-day stuff, which you have to, do within the constraints you have, but then never lose sight of strategy. And strategy is all thinking, where are we going to be 3 months down the line, 6 months down the line? How do we get there? So I think it's important to keep your eye on
Surely that comes from the role of a leader, right? So if I'm a researcher, do I really care about 3 months down the line? I'm more focused on the here and now. So you're now in a leadership capacity. So how do you manage that from a leadership capacity to empower the team to work successfully within that team, but also keep sight of the long-term goal?
I think for me, it's very important first to have a balanced team. You can't have just seniors or leads, and you can't just have juniors and interns because it becomes lopsided. So I think that's why I create this, at least in my case, it's work, create this institution, and everybody is bought into it.
Yep.
My job is just to facilitate, so autonomy is important, accountability is important. So I make sure that every member of my team, irrespective of where they are in the chain, have their 10% capacity that they have to give to, the institution building work.
Yep.
So they feel involved.
Yep.
It's hard, because many times the critique I get is, hey, you're taking time away from project. I'm like, don't look at the short term. It will reap rewards down the line. And to be honest with you, 6 months after we started our UX/UI department, we pioneered 8 new techniques, 8 new methods, which were never used at Wildlife before.
Yep.
So,
wow.
Also, something I've seen working well, I think it's important as we're talking about leadership, really inspiring people to go with you. Like, for example, sometimes we were finding, new strategy, and so really having people bought in. A few weeks later, I was hearing everyone using words from that new vision, and really they were all feeling that they were contributing to it. I think if you can get to something like that, it's really impactful. And also a lot of communication.
Yep.
I think just bringing people along with you. And sometimes in the change management, also what I've seen working is kind of picking on their pains, kind of having people tell you the pains, and then picking on that to explain the reorg and the changes. So it's not something that comes just top down from oh, actually we leadership want to reorganize this like that, and everyone comply to it. It's also showing how that's gonna have an impact for the company, but that's how that's gonna make people's life better as well, and how they're gonna grow as practitioners, and how they can try out new things that have worked. And in this, also, I do a lot of storytelling. I usually tell my teams stories of how those new things that we're implementing worked in other companies, and how that's going to make us all create even better products and have even more happier clients.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you mentioned the piece there about communication, right? So, and obviously, as a researcher, you're flooded with data points. So, when you say communication, what sort of things are you communicating? Is it more sort of, right, guys, this is our sort of business priorities and this is what we're doing? Or what do you mean by communication?
I was thinking, that's a great question. I was thinking at communication, all the levels, communication on what you're trying to achieve, but also communication on, why doing a certain thing, communication on what are you really trying to learn and why. Also, I think even kind of helping teams be very intentional about what they're learning, because I've seen this, for example, in the decentralized teams, like sometimes the product designers are not all super experienced, and they just go and talk to clients, and like you need to be there, be like, okay, like what are you really trying to learn here, and then help really communicate around it, like I'm trying to learn this, and then what I actually learned afterwards. So I think at all the levels, like communication is super important, and sometimes as leaders, like if we feel we've said enough, but it's never enough, like you always need to keep repeating.
That's really interesting. Duaa, I'd love to draw on your experience.
Yeah, I would say from a researcher's perspective, as far as communication, specifically in a decentralized model, there's the potential of your research only hitting sort of your direct stakeholders. And so there's always that challenge of making sure that you're, having your share outs with, not just specifically your product teams, but making sure that, I heard the term earlier, the mini viral, hoping that your decks go mini viral within the company as well, just to make sure that those findings are kind of being proliferated outside of just your direct stakeholders. Yep. Because there's a lot of relevance, specifically when it comes to UX research that's more strategy-based and more foundational, rather than sort of that tactical work, and making sure that that is being, shared outside of just kind of your direct stakeholders. So there's that aspect of communication when it comes to UX research. And I see that as being a little bit more challenging in a decentralized model, because it's generally your day-to-day is with your direct stakeholders. Yeah.
I love to, for all three of you, get your perception or opinion on what is the best model? From what you're saying, it sounds like the larger the organization, a centralized model is perhaps the best way to empower researchers, but if you're a bit more nimble and a startup, it sounds like a decentralized or hybrid model is perhaps the best way to empower researchers. So I'd love to open it up to you guys, because you're living and breathing this transformation, right?
Yeah.
Wow, that's a hard question. I think I'm not sure there is a perfect model, because it depends so much on the industry and the context. But I would tend to think that, I don't know, I still believe a lot in the power of product designers within teams. There is a point where it's not feasible to maybe really have one in each team. So maybe at a certain point getting towards something mixed. But yep. I would say, yeah, when the companies grow, but it's hard to really say it's a recipe. It depends, right?
I think that's a very good point. It depends, again, it's just not dependent upon the research and UX department. It also depends how the product teams are built, how big the product is, how many products are there, right? Because if it's a very big product, a lot of technicality, you don't want a floating resource, because there the accountability can suffer. Okay, I came in, I did my job, I don't have to take it to the end. So you need more accountability with the embedded resource. Maybe the cost justifies having that resource there. Yep. But so I think it should be depending on what's the need of the companies. Yep. Right? I think both models can work. We've all probably handled that. But what I like about it is it's a learning curve. I think if you have a resource, for example, a full stack, product designer or UX designer who have knowledge of, they can do some user research, they understand it, they can do UX, they can do workshopping, stakeholder communication, prototyping. Nobody's saying be master of all trades, but you can be a jack of all trades. That really helps, because you can pull in resources when you're falling short. But as products become more profitable, they grow in scale, I think it's a time to build specialized teams. So you start going from this full stack model to a specialized prototyper, specialized UX, specialized research, specialized market intelligence. And there's value there, but it has to be justified by the product and how they
So moving towards a more agile model that you've got. Yeah. Got it. Another interesting thing that you've mentioned there, you mentioned the word stakeholders. And I know certainly in your industry, you've got quite opinionated IP stakeholders. This is what we want, this is what it needs to look like. And obviously then the role of the researcher is to go out and research, well, how viable is this? Can we take this to market? What would it look like? What would that product need to look like? So when your researchers find something that perhaps doesn't marry up with what your stakeholders want, how do you manage that? What does that look like?
Yeah, I'll give you an example specific to one of the games I worked with. We always have more than internal stakeholders. For example, if you're working for a franchise like Ice Age, so 20th Century Fox has a stake in it. You are using their IP and it's a wrapper around your game or product. So everything you're doing in the build has to be approved by them, right? And they have very different goals than internal stakeholders. For example, your business wants, I want to build a product which scales well, monetizes well, creates a lot of engagement. And Fox is saying, yeah, that's all good, but make sure my IP shines, make sure it's true to the character. And they're right, like we have to stick to the guidelines. But here's the problem, when we launched the product, they wanted IP fans to immediately recognize the storyline. So we had this first time user experience onboarding where there was, 1.5 minutes of storyline and onboarding the user. We saw 60% churn. So I'm messing up the numbers just to be clear of NDA. And we are like, this is not working. And we're like, we have to cut the story short. But then Fox is like, no, but then, we are losing out on the IP. I want to build that connection. Oh. So through research, we had to, we did with people who churn. Why did you churn? At what point? So the non-IP players were like, we just came in for having fun for the game. We don't know this IP, but I don't want to spend first 1.5 minutes just listening to a story I don't understand. So bring those pain points, bring that churn data in front of them. We did some A/B testing, and we saw if we cut the story short by, let's say, 45 seconds, immediately the churn rate came down to 30%. So that's the value there, demonstrating, making sure that business goals are aligned. Yeah.
Got it. And obviously having the data to make those data decisions and backing up what you're saying. Alexandra, I'd love to hear your opinion, because I think I've mentioned the story of Aircall a few times, but I'd love to understand from a research perspective, how are you empowering researchers, aligning with sort of business goals? And I think the approach that you mentioned, teams were decentralized. So love to understand a bit more from
Yeah, I think it has multiple angles. Like, for example, when I joined, not all the teams were doing research, so I kind of had to get more buy-in from the C-level seats. So what I did is that I chose 1 or 2 projects where I knew I could buy time, because there was some basic logic that was already built by the engineering. So they had a few weeks of work before really heading for a clear direction for what we're going to do. So I kind of negotiated that. Yep. And then showed the value of what we learned into like, okay, this is not valid, so we're not going to do that. This is what we're going to do. And then, like, I always, when I talk to the CEO or to other stakeholders, I always use like research quotes and this is like a habit, so it doesn't come as just one argument that I pull off once, but it's like I constantly, like not 10 times a day, but like in our conversations, I bring on the users a lot. I like, we actually heard this, and then of course, like there's the data part as well, as Om was saying as well, it's very important. Yep. But it's really by constantly doing this. And it's sometimes also, I think even for the teams and the mindset, there's a lot of things linked to the empowering. Like, for example, I do a lot of testing as well and lean experiments with the teams. And I remember saying like at Aircall with one of my first teams that did this, like I was like, okay, tell me what you've learned. And they told me all the things that they validated. And then I was like, okay, and what did you learn that didn't work? And like I realized that they only showed me their hypotheses that were validated, and then it was for me as a leader to keep bringing those things that were invalidated and be like, oh, we're actually not doing this, and we're not spending time doing something that's not worth it because we've learned this. And I kept doing that, and in that case, teams were more they started changing their view on right, wrong, failure or so, and also they were more and more empowered because I was like, okay, go out and find out if this works or not. And also leadership started seeing more and more the value of doing that, so I was able to hire product designers for every team, and then being able to do that more and more. But there's always I think there's always this pressure still between we need to go fast and we know this works, and then being yeah, but this is still risky, it's still an assumption, and we can fastly adapt and learn.
Amazing. So what you're saying is one, making sure the teams are agile, but empowering the teams to make their own decisions, use a bit of free will to explore different ideas, and I guess if you're going to fail fast rather than here's what we're doing and why. Duaa, I know you've worked for the likes of Google and Lyft. Love to get your
Yeah, I think from the perspective of research, it's making sure that those insights are actionable. You come up with these insights after any sort of research project, and there's that stage of transitioning those insights into recommendations. And I think every sort of most impactful project considers sort of the business constraints and the resourcing constraints within that stage of recommendations. So although, you would want sort of a huge change when it comes through the insights, you have to consider sort of those business objectives and those resourcing constraints when you actually are putting together those recommendations. And part of that is bringing along other stakeholders and other members of your team to kind of help you come up with those recommendations. It doesn't necessarily always have to come down to the researcher to come up with the recommendations. The insights and the research and all those steps to get to the insights are obviously the researcher's responsibility, but one thing that I think many researchers, at least successful researchers, realize that those recommendations don't necessarily have to be all on you.
Yeah, really, really, really interesting. Another area I'd like to explore, if it's okay, is training, right? So I think the whole theme thus far has been sort of change management and managing change as teams scale and the role of researchers within those teams. So I guess for you, as a leader, how are you understanding the needs of your researchers and understanding what training needs they need so they're empowered to do their job?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, like everybody mentioned, autonomy is very important when it comes to even researchers and designers. We know that we have constraints, but we can't just keep them boxed. So definitely, like as changes happen, people do question. Like I'll give you an example. I'll not say which company it happened. So I had a team who was reporting directly into me. I was their line manager. But then it got productized. Like, okay, they are embedded now. First thing was there were designers who were like, oh, now we are reporting to product manager. We lose the connection. We won't have a mentor, all that kind of stuff. My role itself changed in a way because I was now supposed to look up another team. But then the decision we took as a team, and again, as Alex said, it's not that decisions we are just taking on our own as leaders. You take it with the team. So for me, I use a lot of design thinking. All the processes come up. We come up together. It doesn't matter, it's leads or juniors, all of us together, so we recognize the pain points, we work on it. So we decided we still want to keep the craft side, It's fine if you have a direct line reporting manager, because everybody saw the advantage of, having a craft because they were learning, they were nurturing themselves. So that's an example of how with change management, you pacify the team. At the same time, you understand why executives took that decision, because they were like, we want teams to be more accountable, and that can only happen if they're all sharing, breathing the same vision. I'm like, that's well and good. But at the same time, we are also an institution. We are a UXR, human-centered design institute. We have our own values. And we want to make sure, even though each product team, each designer knows what the product's vision is, they still understand what's the overarching vision for the department. So I think it's that, pacifying, finding that balance between what stakeholders want and what your team wants, and fine-tuning it as you go along the way.
Awesome. So it comes back to that central theme of constant communication, aligning to what the priorities are.
Even if you're decentralized, you don't want silos, because tomorrow, if one team is under, let's say, call it wartime, the product probably, metrics are not doing well, and there's more work than one person can do, it happens.
Yep.
If you don't have those connections with the department, who will come to help you? Who will peer review? So it's very important, for that reason.
Amazing. Alexandra, I'd love to hear your perception as well, but I'm conscious there's 2 minutes on the clock, and I think we're going to open it up for Q&A. I guess I'd love to open it up to the audience for a bit of Q&A to the panel, if that's okay, if there's any questions. Yeah, there's a box floating around.
Hiya. I'm just wondering if you're able to share any best practices of how to bring back qualitative and quantitative research and how they work together. And just anyone.
Is the question around how to bring together qualitative and quantitative?
Yeah, kind of like how do you work together with the qualitative and quantitative research?
Yeah, I think the most successful researchers I've seen kind of use both, mixed methods researchers. You start off with a lot of times can start off with sort of the quantitative and then kind of dig deeper into the why with the qualitative research and have different phases of research. And then, there are times where there's a very specific researchers who really focus in on the quantitative and you're able to sort of collaborate with their findings. And I think another aspect that a lot of us kind of forget and resource that we forget to sort of really lean heavily upon is sort of the data science members within the company and using that to sort of supplement any qualitative work that you're working on as well. And I think that strong connection between data science and UX research can really sort of, really infuse sort of the quantitative within, qualitative research methodologies.
Yeah, I've also seen this starting as well, like from data, like for example, I don't know, like retention is dropping by X or a certain user is dropping at a certain page, and then you need to understand the why, so you go more into the qualitative part. Or sometimes you do like wider discovery on a potential problem. You discover a problem, but then you need to know how much impact that's gonna have, so then you try to get some more data on like the segment or the volume or whatever impact would be. So I think this usually needs to work hand in hand, even though sometimes it's like one and then like backed by the other. But it's like usually, or in order to really have both sides of the medal, you need to check out both, and in time see how that evolves as well, because sometimes it's a surprise effect and like you see some data, but then like in time you learn that the trend is not exactly the same, and then you need more about the why it happens as well. Amazing.
So I think we're actually out of time. There's some angry-looking people over there saying we're out of time. So I want to thank you for your participation today, and hopefully you found the talk really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.